Thank you, Ari. It is always a treat for Congregation B'nai Israel to co-sponsor with the Community Scholar Program. Last year, this time together, we traveled to Lithuania and Poland. And those trips, as all trips, make an impact that ripples forward, images and people you meet that change how you see the world. And in traveling, what's evident is that your guide, to a great degree, makes the experience. It's your guide who gives context, who tells a story, who translates a language to give you access to a place that in so many ways is new. And that's very much true as our opportunity tonight to have one of the great guides for the Zohar. The Zohar itself, in some ways, is a foreign land. In its original, it's written in Aramaic. It's the story of people traveling and discovering wisdom in strangers they meet along the way. I had the opportunity with Professor Matt, with Danny, setting up a Facebook site called Amud Yomi Zohar, to spend 5.5 years, just having completed 2 weeks ago, the journey across what I call Zohar land. And I could not have done it without the masterful help of Danny, both with his translation for the Zohar, but also with his commentary. And tonight I am much looking forward to going through the materials he's provided, to see of all the sites in Zohar land, which he has chosen for us as places of particular interest. I do anticipate that we will come through this journey much enriched. A great privilege to have a friend, a teacher, to have the evening with Professor Danny Matt.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellie. It's great to be here, and I want to thank Ari and Ellie for arranging this. We're going to explore some gems of the Zohar over the next 3 sessions, including tonight. The Zohar is, I think, one of the most amazing books in Judaism and in world religious literature. It's a commentary on the Torah, but it's at the same time an experiment in fiction. It was written in the 13th century in Spain, and as Rabbi Spitz mentioned, it was composed in Aramaic rather than in Hebrew, and that itself is interesting. Hardly anything was written in Aramaic in the Middle Ages. The older book, the Talmud, was composed in Aramaic because Jews spoke Aramaic in the early centuries of the Common Era. But by the 13th century, hardly any Jews in Europe were speaking Aramaic. They could read Aramaic because they would study the Talmud, but to write a book in Aramaic was rather unusual. So why is the Zohar written in Aramaic rather than in Hebrew? It's written in Aramaic, I think, partly to make it difficult for the reader. The Zohar is talking about the depths of the divine being, about secrets of interpretation. The Zohar turns verses in the Torah upside down. It reimagines God. God turns into half male and half female. And we'll explore that phenomenon, the Shekhinah, this evening. So the Zohar is written in Aramaic partly to make it cryptic, to demand that the reader really engage in some search and exploration. It was also written in Aramaic to make it look ancient, because one of the strange things about the Zohar is that it was written in the 13th century, and yet it's attributed often in traditional circles to someone who lived a millennium earlier, back in the 2nd century. If you ask any Hasid, any ultra-Orthodox Jew, when was the Zohar composed, they will probably insist that it was written in the 2nd century in the circle of the famous teacher Rabbi Shimon, the son of Yochai. But scholars have determined that it was really written 1100 years later in Spain, composed mostly by a Kabbalist named Moses de Leon. Leon being a district in northwestern Spain. And this Moses was probably born in Leon. He grew up studying Torah and Talmud and Midrash, but at some point he became attracted to the mystical dimension of Judaism, known as Kabbalah, which was just then really taking shape in Spain. The mystical interpretations of Judaism go back to a much earlier time, but to actually have techniques of meditation, to have circles who are involved in explaining the Torah mystically, that we find only later, and it's especially in the late 12th and 13th centuries that the Kabbalah emerges in Provence in southern France, and then spilling over the Pyrenees into Spain. So it was in Spain in the middle of the 13th century that Moses de Leon began composing the Zohar, but he never admitted that he was the author. He is the one who attributed it to this ancient Rabbi Shimon who lived back in the 2nd century. So the work is attributed to a rabbi from the 2nd century, but it was really written 1,000 years later. One question is, why did Moses de Leon attribute this book to an ancient source? Why didn't he come out and say that he was the author? Most authors are very proud of what they've written. They want their books publicized. And here Moses de Leon wrote what is perhaps the greatest work of Jewish spirituality, and yet he never claimed authorship for himself. Probably because he wanted the book to be accepted. He wanted its radical ideas to have an impact on Judaism. And he was fairly successful. Most Jews accepted the Zohar as ancient wisdom, as deep wisdom. And even though we now today know that it was written in the 13th century, not back in the 2nd century, I think we can appreciate the depth and the profundity of the ideas of the Zohar. I'm going to share my screen. I think some of you have printed out the PDF that we're going to look at tonight, but many of you may not have it handy. So I'm going to have it here. If you have it printed out and you prefer to see me or see whoever's on the screen, you can click on the small video on your video image on the top right of your screen. But this is where we're going to begin with this diagram. This is a diagram of the 10 sefirot. I've enlarged it so that we can see a good deal of it. But this is what we're going to spend a little time on. I don't want to go through this in great detail because that would require certainly this whole first session. I want us to go to the Zohar itself. Some of you have studied this before and explored it before, but let me show you a few highlights. First of all, what is this? This is a diagram of 10 aspects of the divine personality, you might say. These are powers of God. It's a map of divine powers. If you look at the bottom, it says the 10 sefirot. Even the word sefirot is mysterious. In this context, it means 10 dimensions of God, 10 qualities of God. They're often put in the shape of a human body, a human divine body, an androgynous body, both masculine and feminine. If this is a body, then it makes sense that Keter, the crown, is on the head. And in each case, the word in Hebrew is transliterated directly beneath it, that Hebrew word. So Keter is that first sephirah. The meaning of the term is either to the right or to the left in small capital letters. So you see here crown. Keter is known as crown. This is the crown on the head of this divine entity, but this divine entity is shaped like a human being. That's rather shocking because God is so different than humanity, according to Jewish tradition and almost all religious tradition. But you remember the famous verse in Genesis that God created the human B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. So you might say this is the archetype. This is the original model on which we are patterned. This is the divine original, and each of us is stamped in this pattern, stamped according to this form. So if Keter is the crown, Chokhmah meaning wisdom, and Bina meaning understanding, those you could say are the divine mind, the divine head. The crown is on the head, Keter is above Chokhmah and Bina. Before we go any further, look at the opening at the very top. That opening is very important because this is not really the full reality of God. We can't make a picture of God. We can't describe God in any clear, ultimate way. And the Kabbalah insists that really the only accurate name for God is Ein Sof. Literally, there is no end. Ein Sof is infinity. You could say that the white space behind all of these sefirot, the white space is the ultimate reality of God. That is infinity. You would spell that E-I-N, Ein, Aleph Yud Nun in Hebrew. There is not. Sof, S-O-F, Samach Vav Fe, end. There is no end. So Ein Sof is infinity. What are the sefirot? The sefirot are the ways that that infinite divine reality becomes accessible to us, becomes perceptible. We can't wrap our minds around infinity, but we can see certain aspects of the divine being, and that's what the sefirot represent. So Keter is the crown, Chochmah and Bina the divine head. I'll now leave the chart here so that we can see the bottom 7 sefirot, these qualities. I think the next pair are really the easiest to understand in terms of human psychology. Because the strange thing about the sefirot is that they are divine qualities and at the same time aspects of the human personality. Again, we're in the image of God, so the divine and the human are not totally separate. And that's characteristic of all of mysticism, Eastern mysticism, Christian, Islamic, Jewish mysticism. All mystical systems try to bridge the gap between the human and the divine. So look at this pair of opposites on the right and the left. Chesed is love, Gevurah is power, or also known as din, judgment. So those are opposites. Think of love and judgment, love and rigor. Another name for that sefirah on the left is actually pachad, fear. That's an easy opposite to keep in mind, love and fear. Love of God and fear of God, or think of falling in love with someone and being somewhat scared of that encounter. Very often the person with whom we're most intimate brings out our love and also can bring out fear, fear of bearing oneself, fear of revealing the deepest aspects of our own inner self. So chesed and gevurah are love and fear. You might say God loving the world and God also not fearing the world, but instilling a sense of awe, conveying judgment. If God only loved the world, then people would get away with murder. If God only expressed strict judgment, then no one would come out in one piece. So it's the balancing between love and awe, love and fear that the Kabbalah is really aiming at. And I would say balance is one of the main ideas of the sefirot. So what is the balance between love and awe, love and power, love and judgment, love and fear? It is Tiferet, that central sefirah, literally beauty, but I think better understood as harmony. And one of its names in Kabbalah is Rachamim, compassion. You could think of compassion as love which has been modulated, love which has been conveyed in a way that it's bearable. If we just love another person without taking into account what that person can receive, what they're ready for in terms of relationship, then that love could be destructive. Think of a love that could smother another person. So what happens that turns love into compassion? It goes through that sefirah on the left, gevurah, power, or judgment. In other words, it's love which is given some boundary, some definition, some means of conveying it in a way that won't overwhelm the recipient of that love. So love, awe, and compassion in the middle. The next two sefirot, I should say too, love and awe are pictured as the right and left arms of the divine. Tiferet as the trunk of the body or the heart. The next two sefirot, the right and left legs of the divine, Netzach and Hod. Very little is said about them in the Zohar. The next sefirah, Yesod, is the focus of male sexuality, actually identified as the phallus, as if God has a phallus. That would be Yesod. All of that streaming energy pouring into Malchut. Malchut, literally kingdom. I'll refer to her more this evening as Shekhinah. Shekhinah is the feminine aspect of God. So really the goal of this whole system is to unite Tiferet, the masculine in the middle, with Malchut or Shekhinah, the feminine. The union of the masculine and the feminine halves of God, that is the goal of Torah, according to Kabbalah. That's the goal of life, according to this mystical interpretation of Judaism. God is not static being. God is in a dynamic process, and the union of these different parts of God, these different aspects of God, depends on us. That, I think, is one of the striking contributions of Kabbalah. I would say that there are three main contributions of the Kabbalah in terms of depicting God in relation to humanity. The first is that God is Ein Sof, infinite. There's no way to adequately describe or conceptualize God. The second is Shekhinah, the feminine, Malchut. If we're going to talk about God, we should balance the patriarchal description with the feminine. And the third contribution is that the union of these two halves of God depends on us. If we act virtuously, then we, you might say, actualize the divine potential. The way the Zohar puts this is that the union of the divine, male and female, can happen only if we stimulate that union, and we stimulate it through enacting mitzvot, through being sensitive and loving and ethical human beings. That way we express the divine potential within us, and we actualize the divine potential in the sefirot. We're going to leave this complicated symbolism now and just focus for a few minutes on Shekhinah. And that will take us to our first Zohar passage. We're beginning with texts before the Zohar, before the Kabbalah. Judaism really reaches its mystical flowering with the Zohar, but you find many speculations about the nature of God, of course, in the Bible and in the Talmud and Midrash, the rabbinic sources. And there we already find the term Shekhinah. Shekhinah does not appear in the Bible, but she appears very frequently in the Talmud and Midrash. And I want us to look for a moment at what Shekhinah means before we get to the Zohar. Number one, this is from the Midrash, the rabbinic commentaries on the Bible. En makom ba'aretz panui min hashchina. There's no place empty of Shekhinah. So you could say that what Shekhinah means in the rabbinic texts is the presence of God in the world. In other words, it's not God as beyond, it's not God as transcendent. Shekhinah specifies that God is available here in the world. God's presence is in nature. God's presence appears when people meet together in love, when they study Torah in love. Another aspect of Shekhinah is here in number two. Wherever Israel went in exile, Shekhinah was with them. So here Shekhinah, you could say, is the part of God that never abandons Israel. You could say the transcendent dimension of God is hard to get, hard to reach, hard to conceptualize. Shekhinah is the intimacy that God feels with Israel. Number three, happy are the righteous, for they cause Shekhinah to dwell on earth. This is the definition of what it means to be virtuous, to be holy, to make a place for God in the world. But this may sound a little strange because we said in number one that there's no place empty of God, so God already fills the world. Why do people have to make room for God if God is everywhere? I think you could say that God is potentially everywhere, but unless we act in virtuous ways, unless we help to build a righteous society, unless we fight for social justice, we don't actualize that divine potential. So to be righteous is to actualize the possibility of God's presence in the world. And in fact, that's one name for Shekhinah in the Kabbalah, the secret of the possible, Sod HaEfshar. It's a beautiful name, and I think it can be understood in line with this teaching. If you're righteous, you actualize the divine potential. Number four, and this is the last passage we'll look at before we turn to the Zohar itself. When Rav Yosef heard his mother's footsteps, he would say, I will arise before Shekhinah, who is approaching. So this one rabbi in the Talmud, if he was in a room and he heard his mother come in, he would get up. He felt that he had to get up because Shekhinah was coming. His mother was coming, but he felt that his mother was somehow an embodiment of Shekhinah. This is a beautiful teaching in several regards. But one thing it offers us is the insight that already in rabbinic literature, Shekhinah has a feminine quality. We don't hear about Shekhinah being married to the masculine half of God. That we don't find until we come to the Zohar, to the early Kabbalah. But we do see here in the Talmud that Shekhinah is clearly of a feminine nature. Okay, we're going to turn now to a passage from the Zohar. It's actually here, number 5, but we're going to look at it in greater detail. This is from my translation of the Zohar Pritzker Edition. And the passages from the Zohar we're looking at, I've copied from that edition. This is in volume 1, which covers the beginning of Genesis. And we're looking here at the Zohar's commentary on one verse in Genesis. The verse reads, "He drove out et ha'adam." He drove out Adam, or he drove out the human being. This, of course, comes near the beginning of Genesis when Adam and Eve have eaten from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and God expels the human couple from the garden. So the Hebrew says, "Vayigaresh," he drove out, et ha'adam, the human, or he drove out Adam. And the Zohar is going to comment on that. Before we look at what the Zohar says, I want us to look more closely just at those words. The English "he drove out" renders the Hebrew "vayigaresh," and the verb "legaresh" can mean to drive out, to expel. It can also mean to divorce. And we find in an earlier midrash that meaning applied to the verse, not that God drove Adam out, but that God divorced Adam. The notion seems to be that God and Adam had a certain intimacy, but because Adam didn't obey the divine command, God divorced Adam. So that's already in the Midrash, and the Zohar is going to play on that. The other thing we have to pause and consider for a moment is this little word et. The Hebrew word et in this line, Vayigaresh et ha'adam. What does that mean in English? It's very strange that the word et doesn't mean anything. Now that sounds ridiculous. How can you have a word that doesn't mean anything? Every word means something. But this is what grammarians call a particle. I think they call it a particle because they don't know what else to call it. In Hebrew, the word et introduces a direct object, but it has no independent sense, usually. So for example, in Hebrew, you can't say, "I drink the water," "Ani shoteh hamayim." You have to say, "I drink et the water." "Ani shoteh et hamayim." This little word et has to precede the direct object, if that direct object includes the definite article, the. So here the verse is, "He drove out et ha'adam," he drove out the human. I'm translating it Adam, but it could be Adam or the human. And the word et simply serves to introduce the direct object. So this is fascinating. It's a little word that appears constantly in the Bible. You can imagine how often you need the word. Every time there's a direct object with a definite article, you need the word et, and yet it can't be translated. So it comes thousands of times, but it means nothing. Now, this is too good for a rabbi to pass up. A word that appears everywhere and means nothing. There were rabbis in the Talmud who tried to find a meaning in the word et, especially Rabbi Akiva. Great teacher of the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva, loved to interpret the word et. For example, it comes once in Deuteronomy, you should fear, you should revere et God. Rabbi Akiva said that means you should also revere your rabbi. He assumed that the word et adds something to the verse. The other strange thing about et is look how it's spelled. Those of you who know Hebrew, aleph, taf. It has only 2 letters, but those 2 letters are the first letter of the alphabet and the last letter of the alphabet. So you could say it spans the whole alphabet, it spans everything, and it means nothing. It's really the most pregnant word. It's full of potential. And the Zohar applies it to Shekhinah. In the Zohar, et becomes a name of Shekhinah. Let's turn back for a moment to this chart of the sefirot. The very first sefirah, Keter, is sometimes pictured as Aleph. So you might think that the last sefirah, Malchut or Shekhinah, might be Taf, but no, she is Aleph to Taf. She is et, because she includes the entire flow of emanation. So in the Zohar, Et is a name for Shekhinah. The Zohar doesn't come out and say that very often, but it's often assumed, and we'll see it in this passage too. Okay, I've now said plenty, maybe more than enough, and we can see what the Zohar says about this verse, Vayigaresh et Adam. He drove out Adam. Rabbi Elazar said, we do not know who divorced whom, if the Blessed Holy One divorced Adam or not. Okay, let's just pause there. We don't know who divorced whom. He says divorced because he's playing with that other meaning of the verb legaresh, to drive out. As I mentioned, it can also mean divorce. So the verse says he divorced Adam, according to that midrashic reading. Obviously, it means God drove out Adam, or God divorced Adam. So why does Rabbi Elazar say we don't know who divorced whom? We do know. It's clear that the Blessed Holy One, that's a name for God in rabbinic literature, it's clear that God divorced Adam. Why does Rabbi Elazar say we don't know who divorced whom? Because it wants us to consider a very strange possibility, a shocking possibility, a heretical possibility, and that is what? Who divorced whom? Did God divorce Adam, or what's the alternative? I'm sure many of you are already guessing it or mouthing it or imagining it. The alternative is that Adam divorced God. Adam threw God out of the garden. Now, of course, that's not what the Torah is saying. The Torah says very clearly, he drove out Adam, meaning God drove out Adam, or God divorced Adam. But Rabbi Elazar is introducing a very strange possibility. Notice how artfully he does it. We don't know who divorced whom, if the Blessed Holy One divorced Adam, or, and he doesn't spell out the alternative. He just says, or not. That forces us, that forces the reader to come up with that radical, heretical idea that maybe we divorced God. Maybe we threw God out of the garden. Let's continue. But the word is transposed. I think that means the whole verse is turned on its head. He drove out Et. Notice how he's reading the verse. He doesn't want us to rush too quickly through the verse. We shouldn't read it, he drove out Et ha'adam. We should stop after the word Et. He drove out Et. Now, who is Et? I've just told you, although the Zohar doesn't say it explicitly, Et is a code name for Shekhinah. So now the verse means he drove out Shekhinah, or he divorced Shekhinah. That's why the Zohar says precisely. Precisely in the Zohar means it refers to God, not just to a human being. So he drove out Et means he divorced Shekhinah. Who drove out Et? Who divorced Shekhinah? Adam. Now we read the following word in the verse. See how he's reading the verse. Look at that little nested quote here on the page. He drove out Et ha'adam. He's reading it, he drove out Et. He drove out Shekhinah. Who drove out Shekhinah? Who divorced Shekhinah? Adam. Now the verse seems to be teaching us that Adam threw Shekhinah out of the garden. Out of the garden. That's how the Zohar continues. Adam actually drove out Et. Adam, in other words, divorced Shekhinah. Consequently, it's written, Yud-Heh-Vav Elohim expelled him from the Garden of Eden. That's in the preceding verse in Genesis. In other words, the Zohar does not deny that God expelled Adam, but the Zohar asks, why did he expel him? Because Adam drove out Et, as we have explained. I love that. Because Adam drove out Et, as we have explained. He didn't explain it. He presented it very cryptically, and he only said it one line earlier, one or two lines earlier, but now it has become a tradition. This I would say is instant tradition. It sounds very interesting. It sounds very radical, but what is the Zohar suggesting to us? What does it mean that Adam might have divorced Shekhinah or driven Shekhinah out of the garden? This could mean that he should have meditated, Adam and Eve should have meditated on the union of the divine couple, on the union of Shekhinah with Tiferet, with the masculine half of God. Instead of uniting them, Adam split Shekhinah from the other sefirot, Maybe he became attached to Shekhinah. Maybe he lost sight of the unity of the divine qualities. Perhaps it's saying something different. Perhaps it's saying something psychological, that Adam and Eve became aware of their own ego. They became aware of self. After all, that seems to be going on with the garden story. You remember that at first they're naked and they feel no embarrassment. Then they eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge and they become aware of their nakedness. You could say they become aware of their own self. They all of a sudden have discovered what it means to be an independent self. Now, this is natural. This happens to each of us. We don't even remember back when we discovered the ego because we're so immersed in the ego. We're so identified with the ego. But psychologists say that it's obvious that every infant does not yet have ego. Sometime in the second or third year of life, perhaps earlier, the infant starts to become aware of the gap between self and mother, that there's me and not me. That birth of consciousness, that birth of ego awareness is in some ways a fall because we're no longer in a unitive realm of bliss. We begin to divide the world into this and that, into me and other. That's a natural discovery of every human being. And perhaps the Zohar is reflecting on Adam and Eve discovering that they are separate. In discovering their own separateness, they banished God from their lives. They lost their connection with the oneness. You might say that every baby is a mystic. Every baby lives in a realm of oneness, and then the baby comes to discover who it is. It splits itself off from the oneness. The price we pay for becoming aware of the self is that we lose our intimacy with the whole cosmos, with the oneness of it all. And Einstein, in fact, said that the goal of religion is to recover that sense of being part of the whole, part of the universe. So that might be a psychological meaning of what the Zohar is saying, that Adam divorced Shekhinah. Adam threw God out of the garden. You could say that in a sense we're still in the garden, but we don't realize it because we've banished God from our lives. I think I'll pause here, and if there are a few questions that have come in the chat, I'll ask Ari to select a few and read them out loud. I can respond, and then we'll look at one other passage from the Zohar.
I don't see any questions yet, so people probably were holding off while they digest what you're saying, but I can ask a question, I guess. Why does the Zohar focus so much on this feminine aspect of God? So let me ask it in a certain way. Is this a novel Jewish concern, or is this a general concern of the time that the rabbis were tying into and then bringing into our text?
Yeah, it's a great question. Shekhinah is certainly one of the great contributions of the Zohar, and it's good to ask, why does she emerge right then and there? As I said, Shekhinah does appear in earlier texts, in the Talmud and the Midrash, but there it doesn't mean the feminine half of God. It is feminine already, as we saw with that one rabbi who rose as his mother came into the room because she was an embodiment of Shekhinah for him. But you'd never find a description of the divine marriage, as I said, in the Talmud or Midrash. So why in the 13th century? In some ways, this is a reaction against Maimonides. Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, had tried to cleanse God of any physical description, and he really made God very abstract. In some ways, the God of Maimonides is very similar to Ein Sof, the ultimate God of Kabbalah. But the Kabbalists felt that if you just have Ein Sof, if you've just had a pure philosophical notion of God, then it's hard to reach out to that God. It's hard to feel any closeness with that God. So the Zohar and the Kabbalah react against Maimonides. They insist that you can describe God in physical ways, as long as you're aware that that's only the beginning of your spiritual understanding. The feminine specifically, I think, is also stimulated by Christian veneration of Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was worshipped from an early point among popular in wider Christian circles, but the church itself didn't officially recognize her divine status or her semi-divine status until the 13th century. So it's really in the 13th century, as the Zohar was being composed, that you had widespread worship of Mary, and I think that may have stimulated the Kabbalists.
Anything in the Islamic mysticism of the time that is related to this as well?
Islam speaks about, uses the same root, Shekhinah, and that means really a blessing or a grace that's offered from the divine. You don't hear about, you do not hear about a feminine divinity in Islam, largely because Islam wants to keep very strict control on the oneness of God and not representing God or imagining God in human form. So that's really more Jewish and Christian. The feminine comes in more clearly in the Jewish and Christian views of the divine.
Okay. We do have a few other questions. Josh Moss asks, does the divorce, or can the divorce also mean that Adam brought an alienation between God and Shekhinah, between the two parts of God, as opposed to just an alienation between Adam and God?
Yeah, I think you could see the split as being between the human and the divine or within the divine realm. The simplest meaning of the Zohar's teaching there is that Adam should have united Shekhinah with her masculine partner, Tiferet, or the Holy One, blessed be He. Instead of uniting Shekhinah and the masculine, he splits Shekhinah from the masculine. And that's a cardinal sin in the Zohar, to split the sefirot. One should unify the divine. And ultimately, the Kabbalah insists that God is one. These 10 aspects are just from our perspective. Ultimately, there is oneness, and we should do everything we can to preserve or regain that unity.
Rabbi Dennis Linson asks, is the text, when it talks about Ha-Adam, talking about Adam and Eve, or only Adam? And if only Adam, why not Eve?
Certainly both Adam and Eve are expelled, but some of the verses in Genesis mention both of them, and some mention one or the other. Here the Hebrew is Ha-Adam, most literally the human, but certainly Adam and Eve together are forced from the garden.
Neil Eisenberg asks, why, when looking at the diagram of the 10 sefirot, we seem to be looking from behind the image of its form? The left arm is on our, well, something.
Yeah, it seems to be reversed. What I call the left is on our left. If we were really looking at another person, what I would call the left would be, his left or her left would be on my right, right? If you're facing somebody, your left is opposite his or her right. So that's a good question, and it's especially good to hear it from Neil Eisenberg, who I haven't seen for many years. We were classmates in Metuchen High School, and we lived on the same street in Metuchen, New Jersey, and it's great to see you, Neil. Yeah, this really, in a sense, reminds us what we read in the Torah. Remember that Moshe wants to see God, and God says, "V'ra'ita et achorai," you will see my back. God does not allow a human being to see the divine face to face. You could say that a full exposure to the divine, full discovery of the divine would be too much to handle. It would just blow us away. So the Torah is saying we can encounter God, or Moses, the great one, could encounter God, but even Moses could not see God face to face. Moses saw God from the back, and the sefirot, in a sense, offer us the same perspective. We're gaining some insight about the qualities of God, some progress we're making on the spiritual path, but we shouldn't be so conceited as to think we can encounter the divine face to face.
Howard Rosenthal asks, are without end and infinity really the same thing?
Infinity is impossible to grasp, right? That which cannot be defined. So there are many ways to speak about it. It's interesting, the word Ein Sof, it first appears in Hebrew in a sentence such as this, that extends infinitely. In Hebrew, ad Ein Sof. You don't find Ein Sof by itself at first. You have it in phrases like that. Something extends infinitely. So it's first used as an adverb, ad Ein Sof, and the Kabbalists then say, well, there's actually something which is Ein Sof, and they apply it to God. So God is that you can use different words. There's not one set of words that accurately gives you the full sense of infinity because it's infinite. But for the Kabbalah, it means that which is beyond our comprehension, that which is beyond description. Zohar really learns that from Maimonides. We should say what God is not and not what God is. You have another, even more paradoxical formulation, which is just the first word of Ein Sof, just Ayin, with the same letters but different vowels. Ayin, Aleph, Yud, Nun, which means nothingness. That's a name for Keter. That's a name for that highest of the 10 sefirot, which borders on infinity. And in fact, it's very difficult to distinguish the first sefirah from Ein Sof. The most beautiful name for Keter is Ayin, nothingness. That doesn't mean that Keter doesn't exist. It means that it's beyond our normal categories of being. It's no thing. It's better pronounced no-thingness. Not nothingness, but no-thingness. So it's pure divine energy.
I'll do one more question before we go on. This is
Great.
either from Ellen or Howard Merowitz. It says Ellen Merowitz, so we'll go with Ellen. I'm going to read you the question. Doesn't God alienate the self of God from the unity of Ein Sof in the act of Tzimtzum, just as Adam and Eve alienated the Shekhinah from the Garden of Eden in the act of creating their individuality? In other words, aren't they just recapitulating what God did to initiate creation?
It's interesting. The idea of Tzimtzum that you mentioned does not really appear in the Zohar, but it's central to later Kabbalah, especially Isaac Luria, the Ari in Sfat. You have hints of the idea of Tzimtzum earlier, but the idea that you're expressing that God takes this action of withdrawal before creation, that was hinted at in early Kabbalah, but developed much more fully with Isaac Luria. It's an amazing notion. You could picture it like this, although this is an inadequate representation. You could picture that in the beginning, there is only Ein Sof. There's this ocean of infinity, this boundless ocean, no land, no shore, just ocean. All that exists is ocean. And Ein Sof wants to create the world, but how can anything be created? All there is God. There's no room for anything that's not God. There's no possibility for the non-divine. So before God can create, God has to withdraw in all directions from one tiny spot in the middle. God creates a vacuum in the middle of itself. As you put it beautifully, God alienates himself. God creates a non-God space, and that becomes the arena for creation. So that act is also a kind of separation. The Zohar doesn't describe it, but Isaac Luria does later.
Let me ask one last thing. It's in
Sure.
Pat Hutt. Pat Hutt asks, and it's related in a way. Do you see a connection in that Eve was taken out of Adam, reflecting the masculine and feminine aspects of God? I guess to say it a different way, the creation story of Eve being separated from Adam, is that related to some of what we've been talking about? Separation.
Yes, I'm very glad you brought that up. That diagram of the sefirot showing the masculine and feminine, I mentioned that is the archetype of the human being, going back to creation in Genesis, right? Let us make the human in our image. If we're made in the image of God and we are male and female, then something in that original archetype of God must also be male and female. So that's how the Kabbalah explains the sexuality of the sefirot. We are sexual beings, we are gendered. There must be something in the divine reality that is the origin of our male and female dual nature. So the sefirot do reflect an androgynous human sexuality. And as you mentioned, Genesis speaks about Eve being created from Adam. We often think of Eve being created from Adam's rib, but the Hebrew in Genesis is more open. The Hebrew word is selah, sadi lamed ayin, which can mean rib, but it can also mean side. If it means side, then one side of Adam is male and one side of Adam is female. And that's how the Midrash understands it, that Adam and Eve were one androgynous being. It's not that Eve was split off by a rib, it's that Adam and Eve were split into two equal halves, one male and one female. And that certainly matches what we've seen in the sefirot. Okay, I'm going to return to share screen. We're going to look at one other passage, and then we can do some further discussion about any of the themes that have come up. Those of you who have the PDF, we're going to look at the very last page. It's page 18. It's a little parable from the Zohar. The next two sessions, we'll go back to intervening pages. It's on page 18, and this one page has Hebrew and Aramaic for a moment, and then we'll focus on the English. You see there in the large font is the Aramaic, beginning matla, and the smaller font is the Hebrew mashal, just so you get a feel of the Zohar itself. The Zohar is written in Aramaic. The smaller font here was added in one edition to show a Hebrew translation. But we're going to work with a language which is more familiar to most of us. This is a short parable that appears in the Zohar. There was a man who lived in the mountains. He knew nothing about those living in the city. He sowed wheat and ate the kernels raw. One day he entered the city. They offered him good bread. The man asked, "What's this for?" They replied, "It's bread to eat." He ate and it tasted very good. He asked, "What's it made of?" They answered, "Wheat." Later they offered him thick loaves kneaded with oil. He tasted them and asked, "And what are these made of?" They answered, "Wheat." Later they offered him royal pastry kneaded with honey and oil. He asked, "What are these made of?" They answered, "Wheat." He said, "Surely I am the master of all of these, since I eat the essence of all of these, wheat." Because of that view, he knew nothing of the delights of the world, which were lost to him. So it is with one who grasps the principle, but is unaware of all those delectable delights diverging from that principle. A short parable. First you wonder, who is this mountain man and what is he exploring? What's he discovering? You wonder too, is he the hero of this story or has he somehow missed the whole point, right? He lives in the mountains. You could say he has a life of pure simplicity. He's never tasted bread. He comes to town, he's offered bread for the first time and he likes it. Tastes it, he enjoys it. Then they give him fancier bread, right? Maybe challah. Thick loaf is kneaded with oil. This time, notice he's more hesitant. It doesn't say he ate, it says he tasted. And he immediately asks, "What's it made of?" They say wheat. Then they give him the ultimate delight, baklava, royal pastry kneaded with honey and oil. What happens at this point? He doesn't even taste it. He just asks his question, "What's it made of?" When he hears it's made of wheat, he says, who needs that? I already know wheat. He's so sure he has the essence that he can't appreciate the different varieties that essence turns into. Now, this is probably about Torah. Everything in the Zohar is about Torah and about Jewish sources. The Torah is available to us in various levels and various stages. And in fact, the Kabbalah speaks about 4 levels of meaning in Torah: the literal, the midrashic, the allegorical, and the mystical. That's probably what these 4 types of wheat represent here. The man knows the Torah literally. Maybe he's a literalist. Maybe he's a fundamentalist. In some ways, this parable is a critique of Jewish fundamentalism, not Christian fundamentalism, but 13th century Jewish fundamentalism. This man loves the Torah, lives on the Torah, but he can't get beyond the literal. He's finally offered a taste of midrash, of bread, and he likes it. He's never encountered it before. He appreciates it. He asks, "What's it made of?" They say, pshat. It's made out of a simple element of Torah. Then they give him the next stage, which is probably an allegorical reading, a philosophical reading of Torah. Here it's compared to thick loaves kneaded with oil. Here he's more hesitant. He tastes it. They finally give him the ultimate delight. The ultimate delight of Torah would be the mystical meaning, the Kabbalah. I mentioned that it's called, that it seems to be like baklava. Baklava sounds a little bit like Kabbalah. What happens when they give him the ultimate mystical treat? He doesn't even taste it. Once he knows that it's made of wheat, he dismisses it. He reduces it to what he knows. Don't we all do that? We reduce everything to what we know. In a sense, the only way to learn is to compare it with something you know. But if you box it in to what you already know, if you constrain it to what you already know, then you don't really grow. You don't discover a new level of meaning. That's what happens with this person. Because of that view, because he reduces everything to the pshat, to the simple, he knew nothing of the delights of the world. I could say more about it, but I'd rather stop here, and let's focus for a few minutes just on that parable. If anybody has a thought or a question, and I'll start here right with this chat. Is the parable teaching intellectual understanding is not the same as mystical appreciation, not on the same level? Yes, it's not rejecting the rational, it's not rejecting the literal, but it's saying don't be limited to that. Whatever understanding of Torah we have, we should allow ourselves to expand the meaning of Torah day by day. The literal can turn into the midrashic, can turn into a philosophical insight, and can finally flower into an encounter with some light, with some divine reality that's hidden there in the words. If anyone has a question, otherwise Ellie or Ari may have to come up with one. But any
Okay.
thoughts? Any thoughts about the parable? Someone who hasn't spoken yet. You don't have to be a master of Zohar. Just what strikes you about that parable? What do you think it might be getting at?
I asked Rabbi Spitz to unmute himself, so we'll let him ask a question while he's thinking of a good question.
Great. I see John Levitt also has a question.
Okay, Jan Levitt has a question.
Jan, sorry.
Okay, well, let's unmute Jan then. Hold on for 1 second. My computer is a little slow, so Jan, I've allowed you to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Thanks, Ari. It's pronounced John, though.
John.
Thank you very much. My question is that it seems as what this parable denotes to me is that not to take everything on surface value, to continue and try and learn. And each step you learn, you'll be increasing your knowledge, but you have to be open to new information.
I think that's it exactly. Not to be satisfied with the surface level. You know, there's really an interesting parallel here between quantum physics and Kabbalah, right? The physicists would also say if we stay on the level of material reality, we don't really know what's going on inside. There's this swirl, right? There's microscopic world and then a nuclear world, a subatomic world. We don't know that the patterns of energy that we're missing if we assume reality is solid and impenetrable. So the Torah also has to be penetrated. We begin with the pshat, with the literal, and the point isn't to reject the literal. The Zohar very much wants to preserve the literal, but doesn't want us to stop there. Don't be satisfied with the surface level is really the message, or one of the clear messages from this parable.
There are some interesting points that people have posted. So Cheryl wants to know, was the Zohar heretical for its time?
I think that's partly why the Zohar was written in Aramaic, and it's partly why Moses de Leon never admitted he was the author, right? He's attributing this work to the ancient Rabbi Shimon because he knows that these ideas are so shocking. If he had come out and said, I have an idea, God is a woman, might not have gone over so well. But now it's the ancient Rabbi Shimon who's describing the romance of Shekhinah and the Holy One, blessed be He. So the radical, potentially heretical ideas are softened and they're conveyed through Jewish symbols, through Torah. You come out of the Zohar amazed at what they're doing and yet appreciating the Torah on a deeper level. So it's really strengthening tradition at the same time that it's challenging the traditional idea of God.
Would it have been hard for him to write this in Aramaic at the time? Or
it was
Aramaic
very difficult
available?
because, you know, nobody grew up learning Aramaic. Why did Moses de Leon know Aramaic at all? Because he was studying the Talmud. So studying the Talmud for many years, right? Rabbi Spitz just completed going through the whole Zohar. Before that, he completed going through the whole Talmud. If you go through the whole Talmud, you know enough Aramaic to understand the Talmud, but you can't speak in Aramaic or write in Aramaic. Think of trying to write something with your high school Spanish, your high school French. So Moses de Leon is writing a commentary on the Torah using a language that he's never spoken, that he's never written in. He knows it only from studying the Talmud and the Targum, the Aramaic translation of the Torah. He wrote the Aramaic in this language, and that's how scholars finally caught him, because he makes mistakes. His Aramaic isn't perfect. His Aramaic isn't that fluent. He has to borrow words. He takes words in Hebrew, turns them into Aramaic. Sometimes he'll take a Hebrew word and add an aleph, and it becomes Aramaic. For example, Abba. Abba is Hebrew for father, but really the Hebrew word is Av. Abba is the Hebrew word plus an aleph. So Av turns into Abba. Now, of course, Abba has become Hebrew. Originally, the Hebrew was Av, the Aramaic was Abba. Moses de Leon does something similar. He'll take Hebrew words and turn them into Aramaic. Sometimes even a Spanish word falls into the Zohar. That confuses scholars very much. But it's part of the Zohar's wild creativity.
Going back to this story, it seems that it's building up, and so the best stuff is really the final stuff. He doesn't even taste because it's got all the different ingredients. So it's really building up mysticism as opposed to Torah or Midrash or Agada. And yet we've been taught that you're not supposed to study, that mysticism is really out of most people's reach. So how does this story jibe with that prohibition of studying the mystical texts and tradition?
Yeah, there are a couple interesting things there. First of all, it's interesting that the mountain man, what does he have? He has the simple ingredient, right? There's no denying that he has the essence, but he does have the essence. And usually in a mystical story, the goal is to get to the essence, right? The person searching wants to find the meaning of life, wants to find truth. Here, this person has the essence, but you could say he's wallowing in essence. He can't get out of the essence. He can't broaden himself. He can't scratch the surface, look beneath the surface. So he's trapped in that essence. The second thing you raised about hiding it and revealing it, usually it's said that Kabbalah should be reserved for those who already have mastered the earlier stages, the pshat, the midrash, the philosophy. Zohar has, I would say, a dual approach. It's eager to present the teachings, but it wraps it in this packaging of Aramaic, of dense symbolism. You remember that passage of who kicked whom out of the garden? The Zohar doesn't tell us that he's talking about Shekhinah. Rarely do you find the word Shekhinah in the Zohar. Rarely do you find Ein Sof or the names of any of the sefirot. The Zohar intentionally makes it difficult because it realizes that this has to involve a gradual process. A person has to commit herself or himself to a program of study, to meditation, to studying with a friend or a teacher. You can't immediately have all of the secrets. So the Zohar is moving back and forth between concealing and revealing. It's part of the beauty of the Zohar, how it plays between those two.
I like what Alan Cortez says, that Moses is the man who came down the mountain. Maybe it means that law isn't enough to understand God. So it's interesting that they chose that the symbolism is someone living up in the mountain where we access the original Torah, right?
Right. You know, being on the mountain is such a powerful image. In so many religious traditions, the mountain is the source of revelation. And here, this man is on the mountain, but somehow he's trapped in that stage one. Moses is a central figure in the Zohar, and after all, the author of the Zohar is also a Moses de Leon. He felt a certain identification with Moses. The hero of the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon, that ancient rabbi to whom the book is attributed, he's not only the person to whom the book is attributed, he's the hero of the Zohar. Much of the Zohar, I mentioned a mystical novel, much of the Zohar is Rabbi Shimon and his disciples wandering around the hills of Galilee, discovering secrets of Torah, searching for Shekhinah. And Rabbi Shimon himself, Rabbi Shimon is also engaged with Moses. Moses is the hero of the tradition. Moses is the name of the author of the Zohar. Rabbi Shimon compares himself to Moses, and he wants to even outdo Moses. That's something unheard of in Jewish tradition. But in the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon claims that he's actually surpassed the great Moses.
Rona kind of takes us a different direction in her point, in which is she says that much of what's been shared reminds her of Buddhist studies, of her Buddhist studies, no-thingness, relative versus absolute reality, etc.
Yeah, there are many striking parallels. That's, I think, one of the most beautiful things about studying mysticism. You begin with your own tradition, if you're fortunate enough to find the mystical part of your tradition, and then you find it sounds like what you've read in a Sufi text, or in a Hindu text, or in a Buddhist meditation, or in a Christian mystic. This idea of nothingness, especially in Buddhism, you have something very similar, what's called Shunyata, sometimes translated emptiness, but it's very similar to what the Kabbalah is saying when it uses the term Ayin, nothingness. In Christian mysticism, you have exactly the same. Meister Eckhart, the great Christian mystic, calls God nicht in German and nihil in Latin. John of the Cross calls God nada in Spanish. So they mean exactly what the Kabbalah means. It's not that God doesn't exist, but God is no thing. We can't wrap our minds, our hands around God. God is beyond thingness. God is the energy that animates everything, but we shouldn't assume, we shouldn't imagine that we can limit God to any one thing.
Noah Taft asked me to ask a question of you. I don't know if he's on right now. The question was, have your studies and years devoted to study of the Kabbalah affected your own practice and your own approach to mysticism in a personal way?
Yeah, to mysticism and to regular down-to-earth Judaism, it certainly has deepened my appreciation of Torah. I think one of the main things it's done is something someone mentioned about 10, 15 minutes ago, not being satisfied with the surface. Right, the Zohar is always challenging us to penetrate the surface. And I've I've really been convinced of that, both in terms of approaching the Zohar, approaching anything written, approaching another human being, not to be fooled by the outer layer, trying to be sensitive to what's swirling, to what's whirling around inside a person, inside a text. That's one lesson I've learned from Zohar.
Michael Rubin asks that he thought there was a tradition that the Zohar, the real author of the Zohar, was God, that God gave this secret tradition, and that it comes to us really from Mount Sinai. Where does that from?
The Kabbalah claims that the Kabbalah is the deepest layer of meaning in the Torah. You could say that for some Kabbalists and for some Hasidim, the Zohar is the holiest book in Judaism. Now, how could something be holier than the Torah? Well, that really shows you that for the mystics, the Zohar is not an independent book. It's simply a way to understand the Torah more deeply. So the Zohar unlocks the secrets of the Torah, and in that sense, it leads us deeper into it. So it's not different than the Torah, but it's a deeper reading of the Torah. So to say that God gave the Zohar, I think, is a way of saying that, it was inspired writing, right? We think of the artist now as creating from his or her own mind, but an artist, a sculptor, a dancer, a musician, a poet will often say, the muse gave it to me, right? Something came through me. It wasn't my normal consciousness that was at work. Something invaded my consciousness. Something took me over. So I think all great creative artists are aware that it's something beyond our normal state of mind that's involved in creativity. And that certainly is the case with something like Psalms or the Song of Songs or the Zohar.
Alita asks a related question before you actually brought it up, which is, from her perspective, she sees that the Hasidic tradition is the most tied in to the mystical tradition that we see today within the Jewish world. Is that an accurate statement, if I'm interpreting her correctly? And why is that?
Yeah, the relationship between Hasidism and Kabbalah is very important. You don't find many Kabbalists today. I mean, now Kabbalah has become a pop cultural phenomenon. But traditionally, if you look at the numbers of Hasidim in the world and the numbers of full-fledged Kabbalists in the world. The Hasidim certainly outnumber them. The important thing to realize is that Hasidism is based entirely on Kabbalah. Hasidism is not radically different from Kabbalah. I would say the simple way to put it is that Hasidism is the popularization of Kabbalah. Okay, now we talk about pop Kabbalah, but in the 18th century, Hasidism was the pop Kabbalah. And in fact, it was attacked by the traditionalists. It was attacked by some of the Kabbalists because it was taking the ideas of Kabbalah and spreading them to the masses. We spoke a few minutes ago about concealing the secrets and revealing the secrets. Hasidism finally said, this material is too precious to keep secret. Okay, the Zohar was printed, Zohar was studied, gradually the ideas of the Kabbalah spread, but Hasidism took a more radical approach. It tried to spread mysticism to the masses, finally, you could say, taking the Kabbalah out of hiding. So Hasidism is popularized Kabbalah. All of the teachings of Hasidism are based on the Zohar and Isaac Luria.
I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to ask a few last questions, but another one from the Mirowitz house. At which of the 4 levels of meaning is the truth and understanding the law actually revealed? Is the truth understood from the pshat, kind of subset of the truth, understood from the remez, etc.? Or is the truth from the pshat somehow misleading or even dangerous unless the remez is studied? I'll go through, basically, where is the truth in those 4 layers, in those 4, from the wheat to the pastry?
Yeah, from the wheat to the baklava, from wheat to Kabbalah. It's a great question, and we're really going to explore that in the next 2 sessions. I've picked passages from the Zohar that talk about the deeper layers of meaning in Torah, but just to give a brief hint at what we'll find, the Zohar really sees this as a gradually unfolding process. Okay, you begin with the Peshat, you don't reject the Peshat, but you're not satisfied with the Peshat. The rabbis are already expanding the Peshat into Midrash, right? This is something that the Kabbalah begins. Expanding the meaning of Torah happens as soon as you have Torah. Once the Torah is discussed, once it's applied, once it's debated, the Torah expands in meaning. So you could say the Torah turns into Rabbinic Judaism, and broadly you could call that process Midrash. Midrash is literally searching for a deeper layer of meaning. So the rabbis already expand the meaning of Torah into Midrash, and then the philosophers take it to the next stage, people like Maimonides, expanding Midrash into a philosophical approach to God and revelation. And the mystics are continuing it, looking for a deeper meaning, you might say looking for a more personal meaning, wanting to connect to this divine reality, not just wanting to talk about God, wanting to feel the divine presence. So they reinterpret the Torah to emphasize finding the divine presence. Sometimes they have to outdo the Pshat, but sometimes what they really do is to rescue the Pshat. Sometimes the Pshat of the Bible is so beautiful and powerful that its full power was lost over the ages. People tried to tone it down a little bit. And sometimes the Kabbalah rediscovers what was there originally in the Pshat. We'll see some examples of that the next 2 times.
What a great place to end, but I do want to defer to Rabbi Spitz, our honoree for this series, to see if he has any final words before we go for the evening. So you'd have to unmute if you would like to say something, Rabbi. Oh, let's see if I can unmute him. Hold on. Yeah, you're muted, Rabbi Spitz.
I just want to finish and say thank you to Danny and thank you to Ari. This is, again, terrain that I have crossed, and having you, Danny, tonight means to slow down and take a closer look at what I've already walked across. And so the short little V'yigaresh et Adam, just 3 words, a good section of our learning tonight is clearly going to continue to ripple forward, and the closing story as well. By slowing down in your presence and gaining your multi-layered understanding, I am enriched. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both to Ari and to Ellie. Great to explore this material with you. I'd encourage people to print out the PDF, even look at it. You can study a little bit the passage that we did tonight or what we'll look at next week. And if questions come to you, jot them down, and we'll spend part of each session as we did tonight discussing it together.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next Thursday, same time, 7:30 p.m. Pacific time. For those of you on East Coast time, Lindy, I know of, just drink lots of coffee. We'll see you. Have a great rest of your evening. And if we don't see you tomorrow, don't forget we have the Grammy-nominated composer Peter Boyer talking about his composition Ellis Island at 12 noon. If we don't see you there, have a great 4th of July weekend. Keep safe, everybody. Good night.
Take care. Shalom.
Shalom. Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.
Good night, everybody. Good to see you. Susan Glass, good to see you. A lot of people tonight. Nice group. The Gallons. Nice to see the Gallons. Good night. Okay. Good night, everybody.